Welcome to the COVID Chronicles, a podcast where we explore the effects of the COVID-19 virus on various cities across the globe. My name's Kevin Anderson, and for our first episode, I'm traveling to the eastern United States to look at the metro hub of Atlanta. With that being said, I'd like to bring in our first expert in the field of business, a Harvard business graduate, Nobel Prize winner, and owner of a successful private equity firm, Luca DiPietro.
Thanks for having me today, Kevin.
Of course. So Luca, why don't we start off with what I would argue is one of the most important aspects of Atlanta, which is Hartsfield-Jackson Airport.
Well, certainly. As the 9th largest metropolitan area in the nation, I believe, Atlanta's response to the pandemic displayed its resilience on the city and basically the country as a whole. So prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson Airport served as the busiest airport in the world, catering to over 286,000 travelers a day and generating around $80 billion in revenue for the city and state of Georgia. Atlanta's top business sector, I believe, was trade, utilities, and transportation, and that served completely to the needs of Hartsfield-Jackson Airport.
Personally, I traveled through Hartsfield at least a couple times a month, and then all of a sudden I was stuck at home for months.
That's exactly what happened to the rest of the world as well, Kevin. Aside from travelers commuting using the airport, thousands of employees lost their jobs at this location. Whether it was in the airport, serving in the food industry, TSA, pilots, flight attendants. This basically just goes to show how even the strongest and most robust industries are still susceptible to adversities such as COVID-19.
I'm sure that had a significant impact on the company's workforce, no?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the city's largest private employer, Delta Airlines, as many of you know, one of the most popular airline companies in the world, they were forced to furlough thousands of employees and had pay cuts, paid leave absences. Luckily, Delta offered voluntary leaves of absence and buyouts to their employees, which helped the company stay afloat during this hard time.
Yeah, and can you talk about some of the other important companies in the city and what effect COVID had on them?
So starting off with the largest beverage company in Georgia, Coca-Cola, they were forced to move 30% of their workforce to work remotely. This resulted in significant pay cuts because people were working less hours. And then on top of that, in October of 2021, Coca-Cola was one of the first companies to require their employees to get vaccinated by the calendar date of January 1st, 2022. This created a lot of backlash. Some employees didn't want to, and this resulted in getting terminated or fired from their positions. Due to the mandate, a small percentage of the company just disappeared after this because of their lack of obedience to the order. We saw similar trends in other companies in Atlanta, creating lots of political backlash and controversy between employees and the companies. With situations like this and overall job shortages, it ended up being roughly a 13% peak in unemployment, which was the largest Atlanta's ever seen in Georgia as a whole. And that was recorded in April of 2020.
Surely this just killed off all small businesses, right?
Yeah, so small businesses really got the short end of the stick here. About 60% of small businesses' revenue decreased significantly after COVID-19. On top of that, almost 90% of small businesses failed. That's 90% of small businesses. In a large state like Georgia, there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of small businesses, small companies, and these owners were forced to leave everything behind and lose their jobs. So we really hope that they're doing better now after the pandemic settled down a little bit. But yeah, a lot of people lost their jobs, their homes, and much more. Really, that allowed small business owners to change their focus, employees' financial health, to their own business's financial health, because at that point, during COVID-19, small business owners couldn't even afford to pay their employees, much less keep their business afloat.
Well, that's actually a good transition because we have a guest speaker here today, Nastia, who is a Ukrainian small business owner in Atlanta, Georgia. Let's get her firsthand account on the pandemic and how it affected her life.
Well, I'm interested in seeing Nastia's first point of view and what she has to say, but I think that's it for me today. Thanks again for having me, Kevin.
Let's see what she has to say about all this.
My family moved from Ukraine to the United States specifically to start a business. We were really into being independent and doing what we like. And since my dad knew a lot about computer architecture and technology in general, he decided to start a small business where he bought broken devices, usually laptops, smartphones, and computers. He repaired them, cleaned them, refurbished them all by himself, and sold them much cheaper than a new device. He also used his knowledge to give personal recommendation to his clients, meaning he listened to their needs and recommended a device accordingly, instead of just selling the most expensive thing he had that people didn't really need. Even though it was a really small business, it was pretty successful. We didn't make $1 million a year, but we could afford housing, food, basic stuff. We could even travel sometimes, until COVID came. And then things changed so quickly, we didn't know what to do at all. We just weren't prepared. Suddenly, people weren't thinking about buying any devices, not even refurbished ones. And I understand that, because if you are unemployed and you have nothing to pay rent with next month, you're not going to be buying a gaming laptop, you know? So our business tried to adapt to this new reality by focusing on smaller and cheaper appliances like toasters and humidifiers, but it only helped for a few months. Clearly, remember, there was a week when we had this huge pile of ready-to-ship boxes and 0 calls, 0 orders, nothing at all. After doing some small calculations, we realized we cannot keep our employees anymore, and we had to lay off all 3 of them. Which was horrible. First of all, we just produced 3 new unemployed people. Second of all, they were our friends after all these years of working together. After a few more months, our business came to a complete stop and we had to close it. We considered going back home to see our relatives, hoping that things will be easier there, but ironically, we couldn't do even that. Travel restrictions and the necessary paperwork were just insane. So we had to stay where we were. We were surviving by doing random part-time jobs, and only half a year ago, we tried to open our business again, but we're basically doing all over again, everything from scratch. So this pandemic was not something you can easily recover from.
We also need to discuss the effects of the virus, which transcend any regional bounds. In that light, I'd like to introduce Dr. Fleet, an expert in biology.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on the podcast. Today I'll be covering more of the biological effects of the 2021 SARS-CoV-2 virus on those that were infected. Particularly, I'll be discussing a surface level explanation on how COVID-19 spike proteins assist in infecting the body and the virus's effect on you once you're already sick. So here's a quick rundown on how it works. So according to the World Health Organization, the most common symptoms of infection with the COVID-19 virus are fever, chills, and sore throat. Many who have been infected may be familiar with these. The more severe symptoms include severe fatigue, headache, and light-sensitive eyes. All of these symptoms impact daily function, especially for those in the workforce who cannot afford to be the slightest bit ill and underperform their societal duties. And I can speak to this directly. While I was in med school, despite my precautions, I still caught COVID. Doing my schoolwork while quarantining was difficult, as staring at the laptop screen for even a few minutes was tiring because my eyes were so fatigued and sensitive to light. And all of the suffering from symptoms emerges from initial COVID spike proteins binding with ACE2 receptor proteins that line the inside of your lungs. The spike protein serves as an inhibitor of ACE2 receptors, blocking its function. And the ACE2 receptor's function is to protect your lungs from acute injury. So essentially, the COVID proteins weaken your lungs so that when they become inflamed, they have an easier pathway into your body, and as a result of this inflammation, it also becomes difficult to breathe. These respiratory issues can lead to cascading respiratory effects such as pneumonia, furthering the severity of the disease. And on top of that, around 7% of US COVID recovered citizens reported symptoms of this thing called long COVID. You may have heard of it. This is the aftermath that ensues after recovering from the virus, and in many cases bringing forth symptoms of underlying health conditions that were not present in the person before the virus, such as diabetes, asthma, and immune deficiency. One of my colleagues, Dr. Shawar, published a paper in 2024 researching some of the more neurological effects of COVID post-infection based on the effects of long COVID on the body. Their research displayed that patients with cognitive impairments prior to infection are more likely to get severe COVID-19. Shawar's research showed that neuropsychiatric conditions such as neuroticism, psychosis, addiction, and cognitive impairment significantly affected post-COVID neuropsychiatric symptoms. And this is where I'll pass the torch off to our neurologist, Dr. Mazza, where she can go more in depth of the psychological effects of being inflicted with COVID. Dr. Mazza.
Thank you, Dr. Fleet, and thanks for having me on, Kevin. Always a pleasure to discuss such an important issue.
Definitely. I actually have a niece that got sick, and I couldn't visit her, which was pretty heartbreaking. And so, on that topic, how does this impact mental health, more specifically?
Certainly, as you said, in addition to general health, the virus has had a significant impact on people's quality of life. Humans are inherently social creatures and we require human touch and interaction. So, being isolated from loved ones, as you can imagine, takes a toll on mental health. Isolation can lead to increasing rates of depression and anxiety. In fact, a buddy of mine, Dr. Poletti, studied how COVID impacted the cognitive function of COVID patients over a period of 6 months and compared the data to majorly depressed patients and healthy individuals. What they ended up finding was that the cognitive processing speed and coordination decreased in COVID patients. And what was even more interesting was that their verbal fluency and ability to perform executive functions, that is, problem solving, was the same as those with major depressive disorder.
Wow, so COVID can affect neurological functions in a lot of ways for as long as 6 months after you get it? But if these are related to isolation, how does this work with Atlanta, which is a city with, relatively lax restrictions?
Atlanta's case was interesting. On one hand, the relaxed restrictions may have provided some relief from isolation and its related mental health impacts. But on the other hand, Atlanta ranked 13th in death rates due to COVID in 2021, which undoubtedly brought grief to many families. It's a balancing act between the emotional needs of the people and mitigating the spread of a deadly virus.
Yeah, and this really highlights the complexity of the situation. Even from a political standpoint, you have to choose between, the mental toll of isolation or the loss of loved ones. Thank you for coming on and sharing your knowledge with us, Dr. Mazza.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Kevin.
That concludes episode 1 of the COVID Chronicles. We will see you all again next week to check out another city around the world. Make sure you check out all of our socials. We are the COVID Chronicles on Instagram, X, and YouTube. Drop a like and a follow. Thank you for listening. This is Kevin Anderson,